And in that great the John Carlin line, I see by the clock on the wall there's a dead fly. Want to welcome you all to the TAC Luncheon Club, better known as TAC 3.0. And I think we'll still have some other folks drifting in from our early lunch, but thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and in particular to our leader, the chairman, the man who, you notice he has no nameplate in front of him. Truly the man who needs no introduction, so he gets no nameplate. But I asked the chairman, who, as you know, has been kind enough in previous meetings to come join us to listen to our thoughts and to share his thoughts. I asked him if he would stop by today and not stay. I put it more tactfully, but the point of the matter is that we're going to be working on issues today that will bear fruit in subsequent meetings that would make sense for his participation at that point in time. But that I did think that it was appropriate that as we start our third season, we ought to hear from the chairman his reaction to some of the things that we've done thus far and his challenge for going forward. So, Mr. Chairman.
Tom, thank you. And it is great to see you all again. I know a lot of you have come in from out of town, across the country, and I recognize every time it's a big deal for you to do this, to put the time into being here for these meetings, and then also the time you put in between meetings. I've seen the work product that the committee has produced, that the subcommittees and working groups have produced, and it's just really first-rate work that's very positively affecting our work and the agenda at the commission. So the first thing I want to say is that this experiment has clearly been a success. You know, TAC was an advisory committee that we started, I guess, three years ago. And we started it as a forum to bring together a good, diverse group of thinkers and practitioners in the space, particularly with business, engineering, investing backgrounds, to help roll up your sleeves and our sleeves together to tackle the big issues that we face. And if you remember at the very first meeting, I said I wasn't any more interested than you were in having a debating society, and we wanted this group to focus on near-term actions that could move the needle on private investment and job creation and innovation, while also looking at some of the medium and longer-term things that we needed to do to keep this wonderful engine of the American broadband economy going. And that's what you've all done. I'll review a couple of those in a minute, but I did want to say that because this committee has been a success, it's just really clear to me that it ought to continue, and I've directed my team to reauthorize the TAC charter. Now, I know today you'll be doing some work on how to best organize yourself for the period ahead, and that's great, and I'm going to let you roll up your sleeves and do that work today. But I did want to thank you all again for the work that you've done over the past year, and I'm not going to be exhaustive in all the things that I mentioned, but some of the highlights that I'd like to express gratitude for on behalf of my colleagues on the Commission and our staff at the Commission. There's the work that you did on small cell deployment and 3.5 gigahertz. That is moving along very well. As you know, we launched a proceeding in December. Julie, December? Is that what it was? And we both before and since have been working with our colleagues at other federal agencies to make that happen. We're seeing real enthusiasm from a broad segment of the industry, and I think we're on track to do something big with 3.5 gigahertz. It's 100 megahertz of spectrum that could help tremendously with capacity, and the idea that we developed together of having this be a small cell band will, I believe, spark a new generation of innovation around small cells that will, happen here in the U.S. And we'll have the ability to export it to the rest of the world. This committee and your subgroups put together a white paper on interference policy that may be the single best work product on these issues that has been produced anywhere. These are difficult, complex issues, as you know. Some of the people surrounding me here have been working very hard on it. We're working very hard on it. I think this will be a very important area for 2013, and you've given us a direction that is very productive. On VoIP peering, this committee has done terrific work. Another excellent white paper regarding the evolution of the PSTN to broadband network. The work that you all did here and my conversations with Tom about all of this led to the formation of the Technology Transitions Policy Task Force that is now up and running at the Commission. Like so much of what we do, these issues generated by changes in technology, changes in the market affect the agency on a cross-bureau basis, and we found in a number of areas that having a focused process has really helped take ideas to action, and that's the purpose of this task force, and your ongoing engagement in that area will be very important. Another area that this committee has done excellent work in has been the evolution of machine-to-machine. I was up at MIT Media Lab last week, and without getting into the details, which aren't worth it, it helped further convince me that the sensor-driven machine-to-machine world is coming. It's coming fast, and it's going to present tremendous opportunity from an economic perspective. When you think about areas like energy, healthcare, it's also going to present a world of new challenges. And so I think this committee's ongoing engagement in those topics will be very helpful. Wireless security is another area, sort of related to M2M, but separate, and cybersecurity. Areas where I remember the presentation here at one of our committee meetings, extremely helpful. Cybersecurity will be another issue that's going to be a central part of the Commission's agenda for many, many years to come, and the work that you've all done on that has been terrific. You've done, in addition to kind of organizing as groups and doing white papers and making recommendations and pushing us to action, you've done workshops to facilitate that work, a workshop on wireless broadband plans, one on spectrum efficiency and receivers, one on machine-to-machine, which you did jointly with CTIA. These were all extremely helpful. And so you've I guess the bad news is you've set yourselves a high bar. And we'll remember that as we go forward. But thanks to each of you for your work on this. I want to thank the FCC staff. Standing up a new advisory committee and getting it to operate effectively and efficiently isn't an easy thing. It's not like there are a lot of people sitting around at the FCC with nothing to do. And one of the things we had to work on hard together was making sure that we did our work as an agency, and the staff did its work to help all of you, none of whom are doing this full time, succeed. And that was something that at the very beginning Tom and I talked about, and with Julie's help and Walter and Henning and others here, I think we've been able to get that done. Finally, Tom, thank you for working so hard on this, for being such an effective organizer, leader, taskmaster of this group. I appreciate it very much. Good luck with your discussion today. I'll get a full report on it, and I continue to be excited not only about the space, but about what this kind of collection of people can do to help us in a very real, material, practical way unlock the opportunities of wired and wireless broadband and tackle some of the challenges we all know are there. So thank you all. Tom, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate you coming to kick us off, and we appreciate the fact that you kicked us off in the first place. Your leadership in saying, hey, how do we change the nature of the traditional TAC to be the kind of thing that can actually provide proposals directly to you, and that more importantly, you then responded to. So you set a vision, you asked us to do something, but more importantly, when this committee produced, you responded, you and your colleagues responded, and we're grateful to you for that, and we'll see what more trouble we can get you into.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks very much.
Okay. Let me begin. I want to welcome Ed Chan from Verizon, and the initiation ritual is really not as bad as you've heard, but we're grateful that you're here, Ed.
By the way, if you survive, you get a real card next time.
That's right. I'll tell you what, let's do. The chairman kind of picked off the highlights, but let's just run through a half a dozen slides real fast to do a quick review of where we've been over the last couple of years and where we go from here. So hit it, Walter. Are you leading with that one?
Well, I'll skip it.
Good.
Okay.
Perfect. So, and I'm not going to go through and read all of these, but there was a collection of recommendations that we made in 2011 that fills 2 pages. Next page. And then, as I was saying to the chairman, next page, the commission actually took action on. Did we skip past the action one?
Yeah.
There we go. Took action on a series of those, and then in 2012 we made another collection of recommendations and broadened our scope a bit to take on some specific activities, which we can throw up on the screen real fast. And so I agree with the chairman that what you all have done and what you have done through your working groups has indeed set a high bar. And what I hope that we can address today are scoping out the issues that we need to consider in the 2013 iteration. And for Dennis Robertson, of course, that just means keeping on. I was talking to him earlier today, and he says, we've already had a meeting this morning. Of course. But what I hope we can accomplish at today's meeting is to look at the 5 topics that have been identified, and I want to talk about them collectively as well as individually in a moment. And then secondly, get your guidance collectively for, hey, let's make sure we look at this, let's make sure we look at that, the kinds of things that collectively you want to task the work group to, in fact, work on. And then secondly, we want to solicit your involvement in specific work groups. And I know many of you have already emailed Walt and said, here's what I'd like to be involved in. But hopefully by the end of the meeting today, you will be able to identify that which you want to get involved in. And those who don't raise their hands, it will be like the Army, and you will be volunteered. and we'll just do our best guess to make assignments where appropriate. So that's kind of the agenda of where we've been and where we're going today. I want to, before we go into talking about the specific topics, I want to make one point that echoes what the chairman said, and that is that when he set up this iteration of the TAC, he committed resources, staff resources of the commission, to the projects, and that has very much, I believe, been a key to success. You all bring your insights, your experience, and we also then have somebody who can support you and work with you in the process. So we want to begin this year by making sure that we recognize the staff people who have been involved for the past year, starting with these two. Julie is the federal officer, or what? No, you're the federal officer. You're the federal. Walt is the federal officer. Walt is the federal officer. Julie, as Walt's manager, swiftly or slyly set it up that way, so that Walt would go serve stripes, be in stripes. But the work that Walt has done as the major domo in Julie's shop has been really significant and decisive in this project. But also, I know Michael Ha is here, Chris Heller, Bob Pavlik, Henning Schulzrenny, Rebecca Goodhart is sitting here at the table, Ahmed Lahuji, there he is, and Greg Nkosha is here. And these are the people who, as those of you who have been working specifically on various work groups, have been able to interact with them, but only a couple at a time. And I think we all ought to pause for a second and say thank you to this team for what you have done to keep all the rest of us on track. So, guys, thank you very much. Okay, let's talk a little bit about where we go today. We want to begin with a discussion, a presentation by David Tereski on cyber and the broader activities of the federal government post the President's executive order and presidential policy directive on cyber. And so we thought it would make sense if we began this meeting with an overview of this. This is not a time where we're going to roll up our sleeves with David and ask him questions or things like this, but I thought you would all be interested in understanding just where the commission is, because one of the groups that we're going to be talking about, and maybe a couple of them, will relate to some of these things that are going on. So, David, yep. There we go. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, I'm on now. And I have to say this feels like deja vu all over again, because before I returned to the public sector about 9 months ago, I was part of an advisory committee that was led by none other than Tom Wheeler. So I have to say I enjoyed the experience, and I hope you all are enjoying the experience as much as I did. With that, let me turn to this presentation. What I'm going to try to do is give you a view of what the executive order covered. There's a related presidential policy directive, and as Tom said, I'll say just a little bit about some of the very beginnings of the process that's being followed to try to give this life. This set of cybersecurity issues, as you all know, is very important and has been the subject of efforts in Congress as well to consider legislation. So far, those efforts haven't led to legislation, but it's important to understand that the executive order is not meant to displace those efforts, but is meant to supplement those continuing efforts. The executive order clears the way for a more efficient sharing by the government of cyber threat information with the private sector. It directs the establishment of a cybersecurity framework to facilitate voluntary security practices among critical infrastructure sectors. So let's go to the overview slide. I guess we already were. Whoops. Yeah, let's go back to slide. Okay, good. So in May 2009, the President declared digital infrastructure a strategic national asset and recognized that protecting networks and computers that do things like deliver oil, gas, power, and water are a national security priority. 2011 and 12, you had Congress considering possible legislation and the administration making a cybersecurity proposal. In February 2013, the President signed an executive order to strengthen the cybersecurity of the nation's critical infrastructure. And let's move to the next slide. The executive order is intended to strengthen the federal government's partnership with critical infrastructure to address cyber threats in two ways. First of all, there's the new cybersecurity information sharing programs, as I mentioned, to provide threat and attack information to U.S. companies, and the development of a cybersecurity framework. Actually, there are three pillars of this effort. The first is information sharing. The second is privacy, and the third is the work within this framework that's to be developed. Let's see where we are. Next slide. So the strengthening of the government critical infrastructure partnership by developing the framework, which is Section 7 of the executive order. Section 4, strengthening government critical infrastructure partnership by information sharing. There's a new cybersecurity information sharing program that will provide both classified and unclassified threat and attack information to U.S. companies. And it's intended to increase the volume, timeliness, and quality of cyber threat information shared with the private sector. It requires federal agencies to produce unclassified reports of threats to U.S. companies and to share those, and expands the Enhanced Cybersecurity Services Program that allows, to the extent authorized, sharing of classified information. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, that's it. Section 7 talks about strengthening the government critical infrastructure partnership. It directs NIST to lead the development of a framework of cybersecurity practices to reduce cyber risks to critical infrastructure. NIST will work with industry to develop the framework relying on existing proven international standards, practices, and procedures applicable to critical infrastructure. And let me say that this framework recognizes that there has been a lot of work done in the private sector and that there's been leadership there in the critical infrastructure area. And the intention of NIST is to take advantage of the great work and leadership from the private sector and to capitalize on the voluntary best practices that have been developed to date, and to roll this into a framework which will not be a one-size-fits-all, but will promote a collaborative approach to encourage innovation and recognize that there are differing needs and evolving needs. Toward that end, NIST has taken the step of issuing a request for information that it's outstanding at this time to invite the furnishing of information, and they've also set up a workshop where they can hear from the private sector and others as they develop this framework. This is really an effort with a couple of steps. The framework is going to be the first key step, and then after that there are going to be sector-specific efforts designed to try to flesh out that framework in a voluntary way and tailor it to each of the critical infrastructure sectors. The Department of Homeland Security is going to promote the adoption of the cybersecurity framework in that second stage, as I've called it, and is called on to consider incentives to promote participation in the program. They also will establish a consultative process to coordinate voluntary efforts to improve cybersecurity, and that will essentially involve critical infrastructure owners and all of the sectoral groups and also the independent regulatory agencies like the FCC. Next slide. Section 9 of the executive order calls for identification of the critical infrastructure at the greatest risk. Department of Homeland Security is going to use a risk-based approach to identify that, and the goal is to determine what areas cybersecurity incidents could cause catastrophic effects on public safety, economic, or national security. And that's a little bit of a higher standard than the debilitating effects standard, which was previously used. And again, this will be cyber-specific. After publication of the preliminary framework, agencies with responsibilities for the critical infrastructure will have 90 days to submit a report about what authorities they have and whether their authorities are sufficient to assist with effectuating the framework. Let's go to the next slide. As I said, one of the pillars of this effort is protection of privacy and civil liberties. This really goes hand in hand. Cybersecurity is partly intended to keep information where it belongs instead of enabling those who aren't entitled to it or those who would try to destroy information to get it. So it really does go hand in hand with civil liberties and privacy. Agencies will conduct regular public assessments of privacy, civil liberties impacts of their activities, and will incorporate privacy and civil liberties safeguards in all of their activities under the executive order. Next slide. The Section 10 of the executive order emphasizes the voluntary promotion of cybersecurity, and the executive order establishes a voluntary program, as we've said, and the Department of Homeland Security is going to work with sector-specific agencies to develop a program to assist companies with implementing the cybersecurity framework and to facilitate adoption. Next slide. Regulatory agencies will use the cybersecurity framework to assess their cybersecurity regulations, to determine if existing requirements are sufficient, and determine if any existing regulations can be eliminated. Let's go on. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Presidential Policy Directive, which was released the same day as the executive order. Actually, before I do that, I should stop for a minute on the last comment, the last element on the prior executive order slide. Independent regulatory agencies are encouraged to leverage the cybersecurity framework to consider prioritized actions to mitigate cyber risks for critical infrastructure consistent with their authorities. So that's going to be part of the assignment for the FCC going forward, as is the consultation under Section 6 of the executive order with the Department of Homeland Security, et cetera. Now,
can you pause there for a second?
Yeah.
For those not steeped in the arcana of Washington, can you differentiate between an EO and a PPD in terms of what they mean?
Yeah, the executive order directs the agencies to focus in the way specified on cybersecurity. The Presidential Policy Directive is a broader context, and it applies not only to cybersecurity, but it also applies to all hazards, if you will. And it assigns a broader role in protecting physical as well as cyber infrastructure. It follows on earlier versions of policy directives that were focused on a broad range of hazards. The executive order really separates out cybersecurity and directs a number of steps in a very specific timetable and as a very, very specific focus, if you will.
Thank you.
So the Presidential Policy Directive is intended to strengthen and maintain secure, functioning, and resilient critical infrastructure against both physical and cyber attacks, including the assets, networks, and systems that are vital to public confidence in the nation. So as I said, it's broader because it focuses on resilience and security than cyber, and it clarifies federal roles and responsibilities. And again, it applies to all hazards, not just to terrorism and the like. Next slide. There are three strategic imperatives that drive the federal approach to strengthen critical infrastructure. The first is clarifying the federal relationships, trying to get essentially efficiency, clarity, and refinement in the operations across the federal government so that there's a unified effort to strengthen critical information security and resiliency. The second is second part of this is identifying baseline requirements, enabling effective information exchange by identifying baseline data and systems requirements for the federal government, and ensuring informed critical infrastructure decisions, implement an integration and analysis function to inform planning and operations decisions regarding critical infrastructure. And the way to accomplish the imperatives is by driving through and successfully completing a series of deliverables that are provided in the PPD. So let's talk about the first strategic imperative, which is this clarification. And there are going to be two national critical infrastructure central functions operated by DHS. One will be for physical infrastructure and the other will be for cybersecurity. And the challenge and mission is to, while keeping those separate in their focus, to enable them to work together to be effective for both goals. And also to provide situational awareness and actionable information. The second strategic imperative is to enable effective information exchange by identifying baseline data and systems requirements for the federal government, and that includes an ability to facilitate a timely exchange of information that allows for situational awareness during incidents. One of the roles the FCC plays in this, for example, is through our NORS and DERS systems, which operate when there are disasters of various kinds. NORS is an outage reporting system that attracts mandatory filings from certain specified providers when certain thresholds are triggered. That's very important to understand what's working and what isn't working. DERS is a voluntary system that has much broader coverage of more sectors and is triggered in conjunction with the FCC and FEMA to determine the status of critical communications infrastructure, what's out, what the pace of restoration is, and the like. DERS is activated during situations like Sandy and is one of the key means of providing situational awareness to our federal partners. Now, and the FCC is actually working on situational reporting refinements with our federal partners. The second strategic imperative will also be done with while at the same time emphasizing privacy and civil liberties. Now let's go to the third strategic imperative, implementing an integration and analysis function to inform planning and operations decisions regarding critical infrastructure. And this is collecting and assessing threat and hazard information for prioritizing assets, anticipating cascading effects, and supporting incident management and restoration efforts related to critical infrastructure. This overlaps as well our DERS and NORS work. Let's move forward to what the agency's roles are. Department of Homeland Security provides strategic guidance and is the coordinator of the cybersecurity framework. There are roles spelled out for other agencies, including the FCC. The leadership for the communications sector is the Department of Homeland Security, as is also the case with information technology. The last slide focuses on what the FCC role in the Presidential Policy Directive is. There, the FCC is described as having specialized or supporting functions with the following responsibilities. To the extent permitted by law, the FCC is to exercise its authority and expertise to partner with DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, that is, and the Department of State, as well as other federal departments and agencies and others, to identify and prioritize communications infrastructure, to identify communications sector vulnerabilities, to work with industry and other stakeholders to address those vulnerabilities, to work with stakeholders, including industry, and to engage foreign governments and international organizations to increase the security and resilience of critical infrastructure within the communications sector, and to facilitate the development and implementation of best practices promoting the security and resilience of critical communications infrastructure on which the nation depends. So that's the specific task in the PPD that's been given to the FCC. So if I can recap, the sector lead in the executive branch for communications and for information infrastructure is the Department of Homeland Security. The FCC has a variety of roles in supporting that leadership role. Among those are the roles that we just covered through the PPD. And also there is FCC participation throughout the executive order through the consultation assignments that populate that executive order. Toward the end of bringing the executive order to life, there have been a series of working groups and meetings that have been established within the federal government. Those are just getting underway. There are a target set of deliverables that are spelled out in the executive order and the PPD itself. Those are being worked on, and there will be widespread consultation with the private sector and owners of critical infrastructure, because after all, there really is no change to present law here in the sense of no new authorities created that weren't available before under existing law. Congress would have to do that. If there's to be liability protection, for example, for sharing information from companies to the government, that would have to come from Congress. If there are other legislative objectives that may interest industry, those will have to come from Congress. This is a way to focus critical attention on a very serious need, and to try to drive forward to work voluntarily with the private sector and others to develop a regime, a framework, and create opportunities for voluntary implementation to help make our infrastructure safer.
David, thank you very much. So I asked David if he would come and make this presentation, because obviously we're all picking up the newspaper and reading about the EO and the PPD and all of the things going on. And I thought it would be worthwhile for you all to hear the not always clear structuring of how this is going to be working. The bottom line, as I understand it, David, is that since this body is an independent agency, it's neither fish nor fowl, and so that's one thing that is different between the FCC and DHS and NIST and folks like this. And so DHS will be doing the overall supervising of the sector in which we are involved. I know that one of the things that David, I think, didn't mention is that there are specific deliverable dates. By 180 days, you will have done thus and so and reported back on. And so our role as an advisory group to an independent agency, even though communications is at the heart of what we're talking about here, is somewhat different. And what I hope that we can talk about when we get to the cybersecurity work group discussion is not focus on the kind of things that David was talking about. That's not our task. But rather think about what are the kinds of issues that are going to have to be dealt with by somebody, perhaps the FCC, but it has to be dealt with down the road, in futuro. And could it be possible that we could opine to the commission, hey, here are things that are worth feeding into the process that David has outlined, but we are not a part of that process. So, David, I appreciate you coming here and sharing this your decoder ring with us. And we will proceed apace. But thank you, David. So let's then turn to the specific work groups and get your input into the kinds of things that you think we ought to be discussing in those work groups. And let me back up and talk a little bit about how we got here. At our last meeting in December, the group, outlined a long list of potential activities going forward. Some were continuation, some were new things. And so then we, principally Walter and me, with Julie and all of the staff members, sat down, coordinated with the chairman's office, and said, okay, how do the kinds of issues that the TAC raised relate to your real-world realities, and how can we be helpful in that regard? Because we want to maintain our history here of not being an academic exercise. Apologies to the academicians in the crowd. But to be delivering something. So 5 topics were identified and sent to you. Where are the spectrum frontiers, and how do we get there? A combination of technology and spectrum use trade-offs. The reality that not all wireless is CMRS, and how do we leverage existing commercial technology, COTS, in those areas. Thirdly, the Dennis Robertson Memorial Spectrum and Receiver Performance Work Group, which has performed so sterlingly, so outstandingly, and will continue. Fourth is a question of broadband resiliency. Clearly, this is something that in particular was on the front page of the newspapers since we've last sat down together in this room, and therefore moved to the front of the queue. And last is the issue of cybersecurity that we just talked about, that we just heard David talk about, and we'll come back and visit as we go through each one of these. You may see a pattern in these topics. All of these topics are very real today. We're trying to however, do a Gretzky and skate to where the puck is going to be on these issues, rather than rehashing traditional issues. They are going to be issues that define the shape and texture of commission debate going forward. And in that regard, it is somewhat different from the work that we have done in the previous 2 TACs, which were, hello FCC, do this now. Okay? And so what we're doing now is saying, okay, here are a list of issues that we believe we need to be preparing for and identifying where you need to be. It may end up with some do this now kinds of recommendations. But the goal is to look at the 5 topics and get in front of them, and help the commission in the shaping of policy with regard to those topics. So let's get to those topics right now. You want to throw the first one up? What are we pointing to? Have we got our Casey and David? Are they on the phone yet?
Should be.
We've been having Casey, David. Will one of you raise
Dave
your
Clark's
hand?
on the phone.
Perfect.
I don't know where is Casey here.
Be impolite and yell at us if you need to get in, David. All right, into the discussion.
Okay.
This is atypical for the way we want to run these meetings, folks. so don't everybody think that you can dial into the next meeting. But there were some extenuating circumstances here that we wanted to help David and Casey with. But the first topic for a working group, and again in the process we want to identify people who will participate in those groups, is the Spectrum Frontiers issue. And I know all of you are going to want to read and think carefully about all of those tiny letters on the screen. But let me see if I can summarize 6 or 8 kinds of issues and ask your input to either A, 6. What are you saying? It's 648. It's tough. But solicit your inputs on A, the issues that I'm outlining, and B, other ones that you think that there should be. But for instance, is it possible, one of the things this group could look at is it possible to compare U.S. band plans with other governmental band plans? Does it make sense? Is it logical? Is it something that can lead to something? Can we identify key technologies that could be enablers for making more spectrum available? Are there new regions of spectrum that might be available predicated upon technological developments? How might spectrum planning change or evolve in order to take advantage of any of the above? And what policy changes are needed for that to happen? And lastly, are there areas of research that are needed to support those kinds of initiatives? So we chose the name Frontiers with some care, because as you see from that list, what we are talking about is what are the kind of frontier-pushing issues that ought to be brought before the Commission, and how can we socialize, develop, work through those in a way that is helpful to the Commission. And I will shut up and say, okay, are there anybody, members of the committee, who want to speak up and comment on the broad concept or on the specifics and provide further guidance to the working group? Peter.
One observation from both of the past TACs has been that there seem to be surprising legacy issues where we'll be talking about something and then we'll discover that there's some either legislation.
Can you use the mic?
I'm sorry. So it might be helpful, because you highlighted it in the text, to highlight what's a legacy issue versus what was the other. Can you put the wording back up? There was legacy versus something else. Oh, it doesn't matter. But it might be helpful to delineate what some of the legacy issues here that we're confronting, because it may be that focusing on those might help us to come up with some actionable plan that we might not otherwise even realize is possible.
And so, for instance, you would see a legacy issue as?
That you have to have copper wires in every elevator in the United States, just as an example. I mean, that to me seems like a legacy issue, but apparently I gather it's a regulation that has to be adhered to by every elevator construction project, and seems kind of legacy. Well, you got to lift those elevators somehow, don't you? That what? You got to lift those elevators somehow. But there has to be a POTS line in every elevator. So that to me has always seemed to me to be the exemplar of a legacy issue that might be open for some degree of re-examination. But so you're really asking the question, what are the legacy issues that could be thwarting new frontiers? Or that if we went after them because they're true legacy issues, in other words, they're artifacts, that if we focused on them, we might be able to, by relieving some of those constraints, find new opportunities.
Okay. Any other? Yeah, John.
I wonder in the description, the write-up, that we might be being a little frequencyist, if that is a word. It seems to me that within at least a couple of decades, sometime soon, people are going to start putting out a lot of eye-safe free space optical. Mm-hmm. There's a limited number of those frequencies that propagate well or that are where there are easy access to COTS components. So do we as a committee want to think about what would be the appropriate regulatory environment to promote efficient use of the next extremely valuable frontier of spectrum?
How spectrum planning might take into consideration things like this is what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, optical.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Adam?
Two thoughts. I think while spectrum is an interesting way to think about the problem, okay, in terms of impact, you really end up with a systems problem and a whole ecosystem that matters. Okay? And so one of the questions is, what else do you need in the ecosystem to make a technology successful?
Okay, bring it. So, and you,
okay.
in which you would include.
So let me give you an example. Okay, if I look at very high frequencies, mm-hmm. largely unused, so I'm looking at high gigahertz. Okay, and if you look at the investments in the technology, it's no longer silicon. It might be gallium arsenide, maybe something else. To get the cost of that to be economical, enough devices that the forward pricing will work, lots of systems issues essentially. Okay, and I think it's probably worthwhile. I think in the same way as Peter mentioned legacy. What really makes for a scalable deployment for the nation? So that's thought number one. Okay. Thought number two is we really have heterogeneity in what we do. We have learned how to interoperate Wi-Fi with other systems, for example. So I look at LTE. Almost every LTE device has a Wi-Fi attached to it. It actually gives it amazing scalability all of a sudden. What you do indoors is different than what you do outdoors. So somehow, in the way we approach this, I think it's good to start some systems thinking and some kind of a systems roadmap, okay, how we best do this, okay? And I would say the last one, seeing my broadcast friend across the table there, is not everything is two-way communications. And delivering a payload, let's say a newspaper, a magazine that many people get simultaneously, might best be achieved actually by broadcast as opposed to over the network, okay? And then the questions, again, ecosystems, I'd identify the quality of antennas, receivers, things of that sort as really a blocker in the marketplace.
And broadcast might even be inside LTE.
Absolutely.
Your colleague Ed sitting next to you, his
multicast,
chairman went to CES and announced
ways.
They were going to broadcast the Super Bowl next year.
Hey, super. Okay.
Oh.
So those are a few thoughts.
Thanks, Adam. Anybody else? Those are three great thoughts. Anybody else want to pile on the issue of spectrum frontiers? John?
From a parochial staff perspective, there are, I think, a number of bands, sort of the upper microwave, millimeter wave bands, probably not at the level that John Chapin has in mind, where I think there are some upcoming licensing and service rule decisions to be made. So one of the hopes, I think, from this group, from a staff perspective, would be that to the extent that we can sort of see, some trends and see a little bit of ahead of the curve, we can make some more informed decisions about what to do with those bands. One of the decisions might be not to do anything at all, wait, but I think we would like to have would love to get the committee's view on that.
Okay. Anything else? Yeah. Paul?
Chatting with Julie here a little bit, probably being disruptive, but the second sentence was confusing to me. Is this inclusive of or specifically exclusive of spectrum sharing, meaning things other than spectrum sharing?
It does not limit
Okay.
from spectrum sharing.
So spectrum sharing is...
The emphasis, though, is on what new spectrum bands should we be looking at in whatever way we're going to use them.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
All right, let's go on to the next one then, and solicit your input there, which is COTS. Again, an eye chart, but let me see if I can summarize this in a few points. So again, the concept here is where is it that consumer off-the-shelf technology can be used? What opportunities exist to support vertical apps and enterprises with a COTS kind of structure, and what impediments are there? What are the technical requirements to support an application or an enterprise on a vertical network, bandwidth, QoS, things like that? Are there opportunities for physical sharing of COTS networks, Paul? And are there things that are shareable that are not necessarily spectrum itself, but towers, racks, channels, etc. Can we identify industry applications or sectors where COTS is particularly feasible? Can we identify the areas where it's tougher? And what both of those discussions suggest. Can we take the kinds of things that have been frequently discussed, smart grid, for instance, M2M applications, and examine the challenges and opportunities for leveraging COTS at different levels of scale? Would an enterprise model be constrained within the boundaries of a single service provider, or would a network of networks be a viable alternative here? What critical changes would be required in moving from a wireless model of largely non-differentiated end users to enterprise-driven models? And how, if and how, the augmentation of public safety services is possible using COTS, particularly dealing with geographic and urban kinds of issues. So that's a handful of the kind of topics that we think fits under this broad category of wireless COTS. Are there others that you think we ought to be adding, or some of these that we should be throwing out? Don't everybody raise their hands at once. Joe.
I guess network or a wireless network, there's always a open question about the role of the device. And typically from a wired network perspective, we assume most ownership in connectivity to be part of the network. And today, many of the consumer devices overlap the functionality of what we might put in the network. And so some kind of model or way to think about network owners being able to put personality into the consumer device might make a more efficient overall solution, whether it's wired or wireless.
Personality into this. This is not, hi, I'm here.
No, personality, just as, years ago there was a concept of a cable set-top box that had a smart card. And the smart card was really the network piece. And and encryption. And so you can imagine that in a consumer device versus what's put in the network, there's overlap in functionality, and you could imagine where either you parse differently or you allow a network provider to control a piece of the consumer device so you don't overlap in functionality.
Okay. So you're really talking about, does that eventually lead to not all personalities are created equal?
Yes.
And then how do you set up the ground rules
right.
for that?
So you'd start with, and maybe that's what's implied by some of this modeling, a model for how they coexist, and then you can parse functions to either the network owner / operator and the device itself.
Okay. Got it. Nomi?
This is a very interesting topic. I also think it's an interesting one because it kind of pulls together so many of the others. It pulls in both of the other spectrum working groups. It pulls in the security one as well as the resilience one. Because of ways that you could look at it, I like the way that it could give us a new way to look at public safety through solving public safety with a network of networks type of approach by looking at ways that we could parse QoS, to define that. I think this is a very enveloping project that pulls in some of the others, and I think we could look at it through case studies. Through something like, I think your public safety one's particularly strong to look at case studies of how we might go about that. So I think this is a very productive one for so many people from so many different industries and academia to put their heads in together. I think this is a very interesting one that could provide some good insights to the Commission.
Good. Okay. I think that's Nomi volunteering for this work group. Dennis?
On this one, as a useful vehicle for getting into this one, it seems that you would want to start from the point of view that for all communications, therefore not all usage, radar, other things to be separated, but for all communications, be it one-way or two-way, that it be built on a single platform. And then, starting at that extreme position, try to sort through, A, how that might be implemented, B, what the challenges are that would say that wouldn't be the approach. But if we started from that paradigm, from that notion, it seems that would really get this one moving in a good direction.
And would it be a COTS platform?
Yes.
So the issue is what is it in today's commercially available off-the-shelf capabilities?
Right.
That is the common platform that can answer this question.
Yeah, and that would presume things like LTE Advanced, which is just on the horizon. So,
okay.
Because by the time you were implementing it, that would be effectively the modern COTS from a wireless perspective. But that would be, at least for me as I think about this, a useful way to get at the problem. And I know those who represent constituencies other than the commercial cellular would find that to be abhorrent or whatever, but it seems like the way to get at this, and then you delta back from that. So throw that up to the group to think about.
Okay. Greg, then Glenn, then Peter.
Dennis's, what I was about to say, Dennis's take on it brings a whole new point of view. Yeah. Which he always does to me. But in our discussions in the receiver group, there was a dichotomy. There were those who wanted to make the bulletproof receiver that could not be interfered with ever, and those who were concerned about the commercial environment, about who can afford such a thing. Well, some people need such a thing, like public safety, military, but not everybody does. Then we come to Dennis's revelation, which was actually pretty has interesting implications in that if you built if you made everything bulletproof, which might be expensive at first, but with the economy of scale that Dennis is talking about, it might be affordable for everyone. Those two might fit together very nicely.
You mean Dennis's suggestion could be surprisingly good
They always are.
Thank you again.
One of the things that I think we may want to consider here is the programmability of networks. When you think about off-the-shelf, sometimes we don't think in terms of APIs that could be leveraged to implement the types of applications that you're talking about, or an API that could be used to facilitate a migration, if you will. So it just happened to dawn on me that when we think about off-the-shelf, sometimes we don't think about the programmability and the automation that's required to leverage it.
Okay. That's a really good point. It's a very interesting point. Paul? Oh, I'm sorry. Peter, then Paul.
To your point earlier, Tom, this is one area, too, where I think knowing what the national band strategies for other countries are going to be is important because, I mean, obviously a lot of this technology is being developed for global applications, but the reality of it is there is technology and there is both hardware and software being developed outside the United States, not licensed in the United States, but used outside the United States, and I think that we'd be well informed to understand whether those strategies outside the United States are going to influence the choices that others are making about what COTS technology is available.
Yes.
And by the way, because everyone's running around talking about, gee, look at South Korea, look at all these other, look at Finland. So I think there's also a political aspect to this where a higher awareness of what's happening outside the United States would probably give us more credibility in terms of, you know, how we developed the work in this group.
And there are, as you know, some serious challenges in that regard.
Oh, yeah.
Paul?
Just an observation from dabbling in this area a little bit. We have to kind of decide how big of a bite of the apple we want to take here. There's a technology plane which we've been talking about here, which is interesting enough. Dennis's grand challenge there. There's also a policy plane here it's oftentimes much more thorny in terms of working through, especially when it comes down to sharing or making trade-offs in the technologies, this versus that, who gets what when, those sorts of questions. So I don't know if we want to go that far or not.
Are there thoughts from the rest of the group on that question that Paul puts forward? All right, we'll bucket to the working group then. Okay, any other thoughts on COTS? Okay, the next item is spectrum and receiver performance. I'm sorry.
Well, I think I heard a comment, and I'm not sure if it was an interpretation of Dennis's comment or intended in Dennis's, which had to do with building up an infrastructure that's initially more expensive, and then later can be used for more things. I would just sound a little bit of caution there. I think we should be pretty thoughtful about that particular approach, because I think we found, particularly in the systems world, there's kind of this saying, that a complicated system built from scratch doesn't work and never can be made to work, and that all of the complicated systems that do work are the ones that were built simply and then enhanced. So I would want to be cautious about sort of planning on a COT system that is all singing, all dancing, as opposed to thinking about how you layer on additional capability.
Dennis, you want to?
Yeah, you're really speaking to Greg's. Greg's addition to mine.
Got expanded. I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah. It was not my intention to create a more expensive system. So, but I think you make a perfectly valid point. The key right now is that the commercial off-the-shelf systems, by virtue of LTE and even more so LTE Advanced, are already beginning to be those bulletproof systems by themselves, because just what you said, in fact, as you evolve, these systems become better and better and better. They may not have started out there. So part of the notion in my comment was, and I'll make it even more explicit, if we take LTE Advanced and say this is the COT system, how much of all of the rest of communications can be covered with that? And this would include the comment about Verizon being able to broadcast. If we expanded and used vastly more spectrum, covering it with LTE Advanced kind of technology, with all of the ability to divide out that spectrum, not vertically by usage, but rather temporally by assignment,
and by priority, how close to being able to cover everything are we getting with the technology that is emerging already all by itself, as opposed to making some bulletproof thing from the bottom up?
Great. I think we got an interesting group here. That'll be a great discussion. All right, the next group is Spectrum Receiver and Performance, which is Dennis Act 3.
You keep saying that. It's actually a very, very good team, and I want to. You're assigning too much to my name, and that's not appropriate. Because the team is terrific.
You and your team. Let me see if we can posit some issues that could fit in your ongoing activities. For instance, should you be recommending one or more bands to trial an interference limits kind of policy? How do you plan for the plan, if you will, to define a multi-stakeholder group that can roll something out? What are the kind of obstacles to adoption that get addressed in an interference limits kind of policy approach? How do you measure the various thresholds in that regard? And how do you enforce it? Can we develop some hypothetical enforcement use cases? And what are the kinds of emerging technologies that perhaps should be identified and prioritized in this process? How do those kind of things mesh with the work that you've got underway, Dennis?
No, I mean, this is, since we were involved in the development of this, and Julie's nodding his head because Julie was the scribe that pulled this all together, but this is what we are working on, and we are, as you joked earlier, we did meet this morning, and one of the elements, since I'm sitting next to Dale, and who's been the enforcement guy, that we evolved is how do we not only push forward on enforcement, but how do we make that a learning process so that we enforce according to rules, and while we're enforcing, we learn from the enforcement how to better define the structure so that it becomes easier to enforce as we go along. So to us, there's a lot in this that we can carry forward, and we really emphasized the first syllable, the interference limits, in the last year. We looked, and 2 years ago we probably were more into the technology. We're looking to get back at the technology, and again, Dale was probably the biggest pusher of this notion this morning. There are a lot of things that are happening that are talking about how you can get the interference cancellation technology built in so that in the end you can use systems that naturally play well together even though they're sitting right on top of one another.
Because they've been fooled to play together.
Because they have the intelligence to be able to decipher the signal that they want and to exclude the things that they don't want. But there's a lot of richness here that we're excited about. There's another one that really isn't in this covers that we talked about this morning that has both a technology as well as a policy element to it, which is very appropriate for the TAC, and that is the whole notion of big data. Because with big data, the ability to know has greatly expanded. We can watch things. Sitting across from John Chapin, the DARPA program that he's leading has implications for the ability to collect and to apply data around the understanding of the environment, as long as you're able to collect it. But then you get on the policy side, there are privacy implications if you are applying that in a commercial sense as opposed to a DoD kind of sense. And how do you sort that through? Because there are enormous benefits, but the big brother aspect of big data is also of concern, and sifting and sorting through some of those items is maybe one of the additions that we'll probably probe into in the technology side under that banner.
That's great. Anybody want to pile on here? I mean, this is we're cheating here because this is a work in progress, as Dennis has indicated, but this is some pretty exciting stuff. But I wanted to outline for everybody the kinds of topics that are being pursued so that everybody can have an opportunity to opine. John, can we start calling you unstructured data, John? Is that the appropriate?
The data that comes out of the Radio Map program will be at least somewhat structured.
Will be very structured.
You asked this question earlier. How can we get the sort of better interference tolerance built in from the beginning?
Right.
I would observe that some of the most interference tolerant standards out there are the ones that evolved in the unlicensed bands. So could one imagine a regime in which new bands or new standards have to operate in or are asked to operate in unlicensed bands for a while, and then they get better when they get exclusive access, but they don't completely fall apart as soon as they have to share the band a little bit? Just a thought about how you could evolve that in.
Interesting observation. Okay. Others? All right, let's move on to the next one, which is resiliency, and this one, as you might imagine, I mean, there is a long laundry list here. You can define this multiple ways, and I think that we actually just in David Turetsky's presentation had one more thing added that actually David Clark suggested. In an email before this meeting, but the kinds of questions that need to be addressed here, it seems to those of us who are working on this, and again, we're throwing this out to say, challenge these assumptions and direct the working group. But are there a minimal set of standards, a set of capabilities that should be maintained during large-scale emergencies? And if so, what are the policies and mechanisms that are necessary to do that? What kind of goals should there be about the portability of communications during this? Do we expect there to be normal, quote unquote, communications during a disaster? Is wired and wireless interchangeable services where you're just migrating back and forth? And how do you develop programs that will support and sustain customers in this kind of a situation? What are the changes, if any, that would be required for there to be real portability, this kind of portability I was just talking about, in terms of storage, in terms of access to the network, in terms of data and databases? How do we deal with power outages? I mean, you pull back the onion and you always find that. Can it be mitigated? Can it be mitigated in a way that neighbors will put up with? In a lot of the recent disasters, there have been the provision by service providers of resources to the general public. What's the role for the provision of services to the general public in a declared emergency? Is there a role for emergency shelters and emergency portable operations that fit in to this? How do you make sure that emergency shelters have the appropriate comms and the appropriate power to support them? How could deployable emergency networks be integrated into the existing infrastructure? So you've got an ad hoc network that you drop in as a result of a disaster, and what can be done to facilitate its integration with the existing infrastructure? And does it need to be done? We talked a little while ago about COTS in public safety in an era when public safety has increasingly adopted commercial technologies. How do you best integrate their needs into commercial networks during a disaster? How do you deal with emergency alert and notification? Adam was making the point about broadcast. I mean, there's the classic broadcast role right there, right, Lynn? And how does that fit into this? And then when you go to the cyber issue that we were talking about with David Tereski, how do you mitigate against malicious attack? How do you create resiliency against a malicious attack? And none of these have answers that can be outlined in 3 pages, let alone 30 pages. But if we're going to come to grips with the key questions of network resiliency, it seems that those are the kinds of issues that we've got to start dealing with. Anybody want to pile on to those? Yeah, Mark.
Thank you, Tom. The only thing I question here is the title, Resiliency in a Broadcast Network. Broadband Network. Freudian sort of slip. I was looking at Lynn at the time. It just does it to me. Resiliency in a broadband network. It's not just a broadband network we're talking about. That may be part of it, but we're really talking about the broadband infrastructure, and that should be addressing all the components of that broadband infrastructure. So it's the title I would quibble with.
What if we just said network resiliency?
That would be much better.
It's better.
Okay.
Broadband to me implies access networks primarily. Right?
Okay. Okay. Done. Yeah, Glenn.
Are there protocol ramifications that we should be considering here, given the nature of what you're talking about, the data that needs to be shared, the routing information that would need to be shared? It strikes me that there would have to be some sort of protocol discussion, and again, the API and programmability provisioning discussion would be a couple of others, and then manageability, command and control, if you will. It strikes me that those would have to be topics that would have to be taken into consideration as well.
Yep. Walter, are you raising it because you want to comment on Glenn's point?
Yeah, I just want to. I won't disagree with what you said, but just to better frame it, I don't even think we have goals for failure in a future network. When I listen to the dialogue between, let's say, discussion on public safety or discussion about network outages, people talk about outages as failures, okay? And one of the things that I think in the broadband network of the future, everything cannot not fail. And so the issue becomes, how you define, what are your goals? What are your aspirational goals in terms of how do you define failure? How do you for example, with a wireless network, the two things I would be concerned about would be footprint and capacity. Okay, I might be able to trade capacity. I know I have to trade off. You can't have as many macro cells, microcells, picocells, femtocells. And I don't know what the next cell is going to be, but some of them have to fail, because when you get down to that level, you can't have a 20 kilowatt diesel generator powering a picocell. So the issue becomes, then, do we even understand when we talk about resiliency in the new environment? It's different, so frame the problem first, and then look at the technology issues derivative from the problem.
I would agree we have to frame the problem, but I think two points have to be considered. One is, how are you defining this issue? I mean, what's the definition of an exposure? How far do you go by which you engineer to the parameter, I think, is the first thing that we have to consider. And then the second, recognize that networks generally are defined to work in well-behaved environments, right? And what we're talking about here is the exact opposite.
It's not. Right.
So we have to recognize that as a backdrop that's critical to the topic at hand.
Good point. All right, let's go to the two guys in the corner.
I look at the last two groups, one on cybersecurity and the other on network, and I think there's two problems that sometimes overlap. And one is, in an all-IP world, how do you protect information moving from one point to the other? And it's different than in the physical world, because you could have denial of service attacks that can take routers down and all sorts of things like that didn't exist in a purely physical SONET world. And then the other with cybersecurity is where the intent isn't necessarily to take down the network, but to take the information from an endpoint. And I think there is a framework where these two groups can work together to really understand those two problems, because I think, Tom, as you were describing, whether it's an emergency service or not, that could be caused by an accidental or act of God event. There are attacks that happen every day that are intended to take networks down, that are probably as important as thinking about a storm taking down a power pole.
Yeah, I think this is, I poorly expressed it, but I agree. That's the add-on that Dave Clark. Dave, you want to speak up and speak to that?
Sure. Can people hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
When I read this, I saw it as there were two different lenses through which you could look at this, and one was it's all about natural disasters, and the other was it's all about resiliency in the face of a variety of attacks, including natural disasters and malicious attacks. And I thought that, in fact, the resiliency in the face of a number of issues, not just natural disasters, was a much more effective way to look at it, because the kind of capabilities that you would require, especially if it was an attack specifically directed to the infrastructure itself, the kind of flexibility and sort of recomposability of the parts in real time were exactly what you needed. So I was arguing that, to a certain extent, part of what we might have seen in the security activity in terms of what the FCC could do and so forth should be pulled into this resiliency discussion, and we could think about resiliency more generally in the face of an infrastructure attack, in the case of a natural disaster. And I think it is because, in fact, we see a lot of the composable technology being used in the same way in both cases. So that was my comment. I thought it was not just about natural disasters.
So you can't see David, but Joe is nodding his head, saying, yes, we're saying the same thing.
Same point, yeah.
Great.
Right.
Russ, you want to pile on here?
Yeah, sure. I think they're called disasters for a reason. I think Walter said this. You can't anticipate everything. So I also think this can be broken down into at least one part's more policy than technical. I think on the physical aspect, there's a lot of technology for battery backup, for power backup generators. It's how much money do you want to spend? And that becomes a problem if the policy forces it to be, airtight. People aren't going to build a plant in that area potentially, or service. And there's also on physical, I see just power outages versus, things that, do providers have to build a parallel infrastructure? They're not power companies. So there's that issue. Backup, there's rules in place on backup on traditional POTS. I think there is that delineation even in the physical side between disaster and outages. And disasters are that. Outages are things that happen, hopefully, infrequently. There used to be this term called the 5 nines that I think most people in telephony are used to be familiar with. The other side that I think is a very interesting area to focus on is what I call the virtual aspect, which is, when you talked about hacking, and there's a little bit of overlap with cybersecurity here, but it's the privacy of your data that's on the network, the privacy of, or even the data control and how it's hosted. And I don't know whether you want to go that far-reaching on this particular group, but to me it's part of the resiliency if you're putting data in the network. And again, the overlap is the cybersecurity team, and this almost seems at odds with COTS because you're pushing for commercial off-the-shelf technology for public safety, and then you want this airtight network. And they're both good goals to have. It's just there's a balance somewhere in the middle, so we have to be very careful, at least on the physical side, how we balance that. And again, I think there's maybe a little too much policy on this one versus technical work.
A little too much policy. What do you mean by that, Russ?
Well, some of these are policy decisions, and I think everybody in the TAC's been, in their different working groups, comes to a point where they're like, okay, this is a policy recommendation, and that's where it becomes difficult to move the ball.
Okay.
So
I got you.
Where we can give you, that's capable. We can make that service airtight, but you're going to need these submersible generators. I don't know if those exist, by the way. But you're going to need certain technologies that are definitely doable, and it's all how much you want to spend, or how much you're going to make somebody else spend, I should say.
Russ began with, we're going to talk about defining disaster, and he ends up, continuing his existential discussion with...
It may be cheaper to move everybody to Montana. I don't know.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks, Russ. Dale.
Could I jump in?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think that building an airtight system is not necessarily the mindset you ought to have when you think about resiliency. To me, the recomposability of the parts and the ability to adapt might actually derive not from the fact the system is airtight, but from the fact that we've given people flexible components. The fact that most of the LTE devices can also do Wi-Fi means I can get consumers back on, or citizens back on the net if the LTE infrastructure is out for some reason by putting Wi-Fi into a shelter and letting them bring their devices. So I think I think we need to approach this topic with a sort of an open mind about what it means to identify and meet the real needs.
So you're saying that maybe there's actually a threshold issue here, and the threshold issue is whether it's airtight versus recoverable.
Right, and this is the same as the security model. Do we build something that can resist any attack? And the answer is no. We've learned we can't do that.
Right.
You have to build systems that can be reconstituted after and during an attack. That's not airtight. That's resilient.
Okay. Dale. Grab the mic, will you, please?
I'm just going to comment that I've not heard the word intentional jamming in terms of wireless, and I'm increasingly concerned about situations where the jamming is intentional. And as we depend more upon these wireless networks, if we go more the COTS solution and so forth, especially where you have a single technology, it's like not having diversity in a biological sense. Now you've really bet an awful lot on a particular thing, which makes me worry about the jamming. And then I'm going to relate, my current thing is thinking a lot about enforcement issues. And so one of the things in enforcement is you need, of course, to find people who are unintentionally jamming, unintentionally causing interference. But that ties really very closely, when you think about it, to what do I do when there's a bad guy out there trying to intentionally interfere with me. So it relates back to what we were saying before, and it ties obviously to David's talk earlier about robustness of networks.
And it ties exactly what we were talking about following David, which is that we need to be thinking about the next generation of issues. That what the EO and the PPD are doing right now are the instant issues, and we've got to be saying, okay, how can we be out ahead on it? And you've identified a way.
If you would,
Pete, no, go ahead. Dale, yeah.
If you would let me say one final thing, and I've said this before, and I look at these things, these kind of networks, and there's economies of scale, there's economies of scope, there's economies of specialization, and there's also innovation sort of things that we want. And I get a little nervous when we keep coming back because everything's going to kind of baby LTE with something else thrown in. I'm not opposed to LTE. I think it's an absolutely wonderful technology. But when I was here, we were still talking about technical neutrality. And what I see creeping in here is not technical neutrality. It's we're choosing for this country a particular technology going forward. That may well be a really great thing. But you raise this issue of the sort of jamming problem that I'm talking about when you're relying on a single technology, and it raises the sort of enforcement issues and so forth.
Admonition, well taken. Peter, Greg,
David on the
Mark.
phone who was talking about recomposability.
That was David.
Yeah. Oh, just a humorous aside, Dale, by the way. If you want to deal with counter jamming, if your spouse discovers that your music service has been lost because a neighbor has a new router, then you learn quickly about interference and how to deal with your neighbors and unplug their router and things like that. But we can talk about that offline. But that wasn't my point.
Do you want to share your experience with
No,
us?
No.
Clearly this is up close
For
and
marital
personal kind of
harmony, I
experience.
had to teach my wife about counter jamming, so we'll leave it at that. On David's point about recomposability, Tom, I actually think there's a lesson to be learned from high-frequency trading. So high-frequency trading is an environment where we learned that we literally could not defend against failure, that it had the resilience was the premium attribute that we had to design to. And so what I would say is that David's point about recomposability is really an important one because the legacy architecture of most communication networks assume we're going to fortify these networks so they don't go down. And I just can't emphasize enough, at least in my world, in the high-frequency trading world, that the recomposability of components and the ability to very, very quickly recover from failure, because we measure failure in individual trades can fail, right? It's a key architectural philosophical change that leads to a completely different way of designing and protecting systems.
Great
so
point.
I really want to reinforce
Got it.
that I think that his point is really excellent.
Got it. Greg.
I'd like to agree with something you said, Tom, agree with Dale, disagree with Russ, and then agree with him, and agree with Peter.
Wait a minute, I need to keep score here. There's how many agrees and how many disagrees?
But all in two sentences. Just to bring a little of the experience from the NFPA, the fire protection. They're sticking with the PSTN, and unfortunately for them, they're not going to be able to for very long. But
I'm sorry, who's sticking it in your views?
National Fire Protection Association. Their regulations govern most of our fire protection devices. And the main problem they have is the type, what you were talking about with resiliency, and they require redundancies all over the place. They require backup power of at least 24 hours, in some cases 60 hours. So obviously what you said, Tom, about the backup power is a big deal with IP networks, and one of the reasons you don't see a lot of fire protection over IP networks yet. PSTN, they did a wonderful job with that. But the redundancies, and I'm pushing at our committee meetings there for two modalities of redundancy, because that's the best way to overcome any failures. You want to, if your IP network goes down, your radio network can carry the messages. Or if your radio gets jammed, Dale, before Dale can send his guys out to stop the jammers, we will send the messages over IP or a cell network or some other network. But I think for the future, in every one of these things, some form of multimodality is necessary for the situations where you can't fail.
Yep. We've been spoiled into thinking there is one solution when there never is. Mark.
Good lead-in, actually. One of the things I want to talk about is, as we're looking at survivability of communications through disaster and things can happen, a lot of things we should look at is existing rules and policies that we have that aren't being basically adhered to the way that they're originally written. As he was talking about survivability of dual networks, one falling over to another. One policy that I'll just point out, for instance, is municipalities, say 911 centers, other groups, are required to have 2 connections. Now, the true ruling of this was meant that there were redundant communications networks. The problem is the municipalities do not have money. It's easy for them to get money to build out initially, but very hard for monthly ongoing. So if they have a cable provider or a group that they've bartered for services through, they will get 2 connections from the same provider, yet it meets the rules. Now, that we've seen that failure now happen, actually, as we've had outages in Virginia and other places where we've had failures in communications because it was actually a single provider instead of 2. I think that if we go back and sort of review those particular things, we can make a lot of improvements by just adhering to what those originally were meant to be. Just like he was talking about in elevators where it still requires a copper wire. That shouldn't really have meant a POTS wire. It should have meant that there was communications available in case of an emergency in there. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do by looking at existing rules and policies there that we can just sort of redefine into the modern era.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Ed? We'll just keep going. Ed, Adam, Russ. We'll just work.
I'll come back.
Okay.
I mean, this is all obviously near and dear to everyone's heart, mine especially in this particular case. I think Walt already touched on this before. Resiliency is not just airtight everything. It's about recovering, quickly or heal around it when you see issues. And for the particular working group, I think the important thing here is that you pragmatically go after the stuff that are higher probability in happening. Like as an example, jamming on one particular spot, we have multiple frequencies across so many different folks. I think we got to pragmatically go after the ones that are more likely to happen. Like for example, for us, the power issues is fundamental to us, so that's why one of the issues that for us to go after is that in particular. So to the extent that the working group needs to work on something, I would think that you want to go after things that are more higher probability of happening, inclusive of the cybersecurity stuff. That's fine. LTE, one of the things that I repeatedly hear about some of the COTS perspective, to the extent that it's a common technology that a lot of us can use in the different places, I think it's an actual good place for us to be in terms of using it as a recovery capability, regardless of where you are or what network you're on. So I don't think it's a problem. It's actually a potential solution for having a more resilient networks.
I'm jumping ahead for a second, but when we get to the end of this and we're talking about next steps for each group, I'm going to come back exactly to what you just said, Ed, which is one of the tasks of the working groups is to prioritize among this list of things. Adam.
So, the first thing is, I think when we had the transition working group, Bud Tribble actually wrote a very nice piece on multimodality, because we don't just use one method of communications. Okay, and so what resiliency might mean and our intuition about it, in today's environment we have many, many technologies, really should be very different. I'd say second point is really this whole notion of priorities. I think it's been mentioned a few times. But look, I mean, everything isn't really worthwhile defending and paying the bucks for. So you really do have some hierarchy again of things which are absolutely 5/9 or 6/9, maybe even special networks, air gap from everything else, so they're not susceptible. Okay, all the way through stuff that is, let's put it this way. It's not a tragedy if I can't play a game on my console for a few minutes, essentially. Okay, so that's one set of thoughts. The next one, which really sort of concerns me, is that when I look at the land infrastructure, what you can deliver over fiber is still and will continue to be many orders of magnitude of what I can do over the air. Okay? And when we think of networks, okay, if I look at future trends of more stuff moving to the cloud, for example, okay, the impact that has is bigger and bigger over time, essentially. Okay? And so, again, a notion of how do you deal with the heterogeneity of what we actually have in a practical way. Okay?
And how the cloud raises the ante on the importance of the resiliency of the network. Milo.
The topic of resiliency in a network that's growing, has been growing for the last decade at 40 to 45% compounded annually is an interesting one. That is to say, if you just stop adding capacity, if you just stop growing, the load from the edge will cause congestion in a variety of locations, which is a problem. In many of the disasters we've seen recently, that the network outage was accompanied with power failures that shed load. So we had situations where the source load from consumers or businesses went away. There are a class of outages where that load doesn't go away, but the network still has to deal with failure. And those kind of problems, I think, are going to be very difficult to deal with our current architecture of how we interconnect and how we carry traffic. And I think one of the things that if we're really talking about a broader set of resiliency challenges is how we get some ahead of the game, that we have more margin in the system and we can use that margin to carry traffic in some form of prioritized way. Because the problem is your priorities might not be mine, and in an environment where we have distributed control, there's nobody gets to decide. It's a very challenging problem.
So you're not talking about a new topology as much as you're talking about the ability to prioritize.
I don't think I totally agree with the comments about multimodality. There are classes of failures where that kind of thing works really well for. But consider a situation where you had access networks and users still up, but certain failures happening inside a distribution network where congestion all of a sudden now is just flooding the system and no one can get anything through. And I think those what happens and what resiliency means in these kind of scenarios is going to be different than the classic. The city goes black and now you're just reconstituting communications with portable devices with limited data requirements.
This COTS, everything. We're back to how all of these topics, frankly, all relate together.
And I don't think actually the Commission has much span in most of this. So it's an interesting challenge.
Most statutory span is what you're talking about, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Russ.
So a quick comment, sort of piling on to Adam and Milo. I think there's a systems approach as networks have evolved. I could be a provider, a wireless provider, but the person who has the fiber or copper that provides service for my backhaul is somebody else. So resiliency gets to be very complex. I've got 2 or 3 players now, and then I may be getting the service if I'm on a landline, or I'm sorry, whatever you call those now, those physical lines to my home, instead of a virtual wireless line. But if I'm on a service like that, I could be going to the cloud for a different service. So resiliency, now you've got all these different players in the game. And I think it is, like, it may be your priority, maybe it's not somebody else's priority. So I think there's this real complex ecosystem of players now. So this becomes, again, it goes back to my comment, there's some real policy-intensive things, as well as some technical issues that need to be worked out. How do you hand off policy? How do you hand off when there's a failure? And I think even when you look at a natural disaster, if you get something like a hurricane, some of the power backup systems were flooded. It doesn't do much good to have a generator when it's 3 feet underwater. And at the same point, the tower was blown over. So what do you got? Because it's like people try to hedge their bets. I think there is this complex relationship. This is a complex task. I think one of the 5 ones. It kind of looks basic, but it's complex.
Well,
we talked somewhat about this at lunch. It's an interesting issue where you have an ecosystem, and we saw this during Katrina, that you had failures where companies had actually bought duplicate circuits, but because of the way the industry is constructed now, they didn't own those circuits, and it turns out that the duplicate circuits went through the same company and in a couple instances and through a critical path. And although those circuits were sold as duplicates, unbeknownst, because the information wasn't traded back and forth between the companies, they wound up on the same physical facility. One of the issues I think that needs to be looked at is how do companies get to exchange critical information like that in terms of, what is the service requirement associated with it, and if it changes, how is the change notified? A lot of that's a paper process today, where if I lease a circuit from another carrier, I get the endpoints, not the visibility of how that circuit's treated. And it's a very challenging problem. But we're going increasingly into an environment, as people have kept referencing, where there's not a single service provider. There's an ecosystem of providers, each of whom has to fulfill their policy-driven role with respect to contracts they have out to other companies, and do that more reliably than they do today.
Okay, great. I'm sorry. Yes, David.
Yeah, I just want to highlight, I think Dave Clark mentioned reconstitution, and I think it came back up, I think it was with Greg. That seemed to me to be, sort of an important subcase of this resilience discussion we've had, and I think different from some of the other aspects, and sufficiently so and important enough that without being prescriptive, I'd like to at least, suggest whoever leads this activity consider setting up a separate subgroup just on that topic, because I suspect if you make really good progress just on that topic, you can do a lot. And on the other hand, based on sort of just the last comments we heard, we have all these different components. They interact, as we've seen these kinds of interactions in the electricity industry where you don't have enough power to turn the power on. And I can easily, imagine us having those kinds of interactions in our system when we go to try to reconstitute the broadband environment. So I'd just like to suggest taking that alone is a really interesting topic, maybe worth considering. Not so much a separate, panel or topic, but subgroup.
Yeah, but inside it. Yep. I think we have another volunteer.
One less small thought. I found David Clark's and Peter Bloom's comments about looking at resiliency as more as like reconstituting services. I thought that was very powerful, and I do agree with it wholeheartedly. I would say, though, as a service provider, I feel like it would be irresponsible of me not to still also think of resiliency as making sure we still have the right natural incentives there for people to invest in facility resiliency. I think that still in many places throughout our country, there are places where our facilities really aren't built to be as resilient as they could. And I know our company has made really significant, many millions of dollars of investment in making our networks more resilient. And I think a lot of that is just because we feel it's part of being competitive. We want to make sure that in an outage that that our services survive really well and that we don't lose our customers to a competitor. And I think we need to make sure that those natural incentives exist still as well. So I think they are really important. When I look at facilities, just as I travel throughout America, I can see much opportunity for still significant investment, which would be very important to our country.
One of the really exciting things that all of us are privileged to deal with is to live in a time where we're evolving and having to deal with these kinds of issues. Mm-hmm. We solved that once from a policy perspective, to Russ's point. We solved that once from a policy perspective, saying that this was part of a natural monopoly, okay, and you built it in and you paid for that and all this sort of stuff. We have made a policy decision saying that we are going to be a competitive environment. We're going to be multimodal. And in that kind of an environment, how do we deal with these kinds of issues? And that's really the yes. mega question that we're asking throughout all of these. And if it was simple, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. Peter?
So to support Nomi's point, and what Milo said, more of the load now is coming from the edge. So the issue of recomposition or reconstitution, whichever word you want to use, I totally agree with Nomi. The closer you are to the center and to the infrastructure, probably the less flexible you can be on some of these reconstitution strategies. But because the nature of the network's changing, we have so much load coming from the edge. I presume, Milo, you would agree that reconstitution and resiliency at the edge is probably something that you should and could potentially implement. And then the other point I'll make that we learned, unfortunately, in New York was 1 second, 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week. And to Nomi's point, if you have to recover in a second or a minute, you're not going to do that with an incredibly flexible, nimble, reconstitutable architecture. So I would say that as the group is working, we kind of think about in financial services a second, a minute, an hour, and a week, a day and a week. And where you are in terms of that sometimes defines whether you need fixed, hardcore infrastructure or more resilient, flexible infrastructure.
Okay, I think we have defined a really hot topic, a really interesting topic, that David's suggestion about perhaps breaking it down into a subgroup or two makes sense. But again, at the end of this, we're going to be talking about, folks, it's time to be identifying where you want to be participating. And in particular, those of you who have spoken up, but those of you who haven't as well. I mean, this is an obvious area for your involvement. Let's go on to the cybersecurity one. Can you hit the next one? David Tereski gave us an overview that, as I said before, kind of described what our role is and our role isn't, both as an agency and as an advisory committee to that agency. So the question before us is to look forward and to say, what are the issues that are going to have to be dealt with? The executive order and the PPD, to my understanding at least, are directed at specific issues raised in the current appreciation of the broad topic of critical infrastructure. Around this table, we could all have sub-iterations off of that. And so the question for this working group is, how do we help the agency anticipate what some of those issues might be and look forward? I mean, are there, frankly, advantages in a broadband infrastructure? And likewise, are there unique risks that are offered in that kind of a situation? How do we gauge network security? What kind of tracking mechanisms exist for that purpose? How do we coordinate policies? Because there are a whole different level of authorities that affect here. How do we deal with devices? And where is the authority for devices? These are all issues that are going to be on the horizon, if they aren't already, and that it would be worthwhile for this group to tee up and chew on with some thoughts to the Commission as to where they need to be thinking ahead on this topic. Are there any additional thoughts on Adam? Is your sign up for this or for the last discussion? Okay, okay. Milo is for this discussion. Okay.
So, I'm not exactly sure why this is in scope for an FCC TAC.
Okay.
Because DHS is prime for this in most contexts. There's a bunch of the questions you outlined have been outlined in other forums, and it's not clear that if this group came up with a set of recommendations, that the Commission would be the agency to carry them out. So I'm just questioning what is unique about the Commission's role here that this group should go after these topics in parallel with all these other groups and all these other jurisdictions.
I think that's the question getting asked. Okay, and as I poorly tried to explain, a while ago, yes, DHS and others are the ones with the line authority over this. As the expert agency on telecommunications, however, it probably is not. And this is a call the chairman has to make, and so I'm now way above my pay grade. Okay, but that we might want to opine to the chairman whether or not the following kinds of issues are issues that, as the expert agency, he ought to at least have an opinion on. And if he has an opinion, here's the kind of thought process we think he ought to be going through. I think it's been made clear by David Turetsky and others that the answer here is that the FCC is going to step out and have this rulemaking to make that decision. Russ?
I just want to add, outside of the issue Milo raises, whether it's a fit here, I think security is one of the most important things, and it's going to become even more important as we move towards this network that our company calls the Internet of Everything. You're going to have even more and more devices that are going to have potential security issues, or, as I put it, access into the network or areas to exploit. So as we get to 50 billion devices, there's a lot of potential security threats there, and I think it is a big issue. I think it's included in this, the infrastructure definition, because a lot of those are going to be cloud-based. Some of those are not going to be, duplex. Some of them may be just machine to machine, but still, I think one of the things the FCC can do, at least, is to try to push for standards. I do want to say a lot of the vendors, including ourselves, are really focused on security. As Nomi mentioned, we don't want to lose customers by having insecure products or anything. So I think there's an industry level of support there already. From the FCC's perspective, I would see a push for some type of standardization and support in that respect.
Joe?
I think about the vulnerability of the network and the elements in the network, and then I think about the vulnerability of people getting access to information that transits the network. In many cases, some of those points of vulnerability are the same. And so to the degree whether we work on this issue exclusively or with DHS, I think that there needs to be a tight coordination, because you can make policy decisions or technology decisions about how to deal with something that could impact both the transport of information and the resiliency of the network, as well as the privacy of the information.
Mark, are you okay? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the, as he was talking about, and Naomi was talking about as well, is the fact of survivability of the network and the transportation. One of the things that we've done, that's been done for communications, is internet exchange points. And that helps in both resilience, and it also cuts down on cost of transport by keeping things localized. A lot of countries, small countries such as Jamaica and other ones, in order to survive in case something happens, where they have most of the communications as far as the internet is coming in from Florida into communications, and it's costly to go back and forth, is they built local exchange inside of JNAP inside, so that in case something happens and they were isolated by themselves, they could still communicate with themselves in communications without relying upon the outside world. We do this in the U.S. and exchange points, but we haven't brought it down. If we had requirements for internet exchange points, say in each state, at least into a minimum for internet exchange points inside, survivability communications would be more reliant upon each one. It's a very easy thing to do. Then the networks would have an exchange point for survivability, and it's cost effective, and it would really help into solving a lot of problems, I believe.
I think we need to have a road trip to Jamaica to inspect that. Anybody else? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I mean, this is an issue that is multifaceted, not clear cut in any stretch of the imagination. And this working group will obviously be an interesting discussion that we will bring back to the overall group. If there's nothing more to say on the cyber topic, let me see if I can reflect a little bit on where we go next. First of all, we need you all to volunteer for as many of these working groups as you think you can stomach. And again, we hope you will do that within the next 24 hours, either by collaring Walter here or emailing him.
It'd be easier for me if I'll send out an email to everybody with a specific header so I can pick out the stream of useless email we get here. And
you have
so just let me know what you would prefer to volunteer for, and I'll feed that back to Tom. So I'll send it, after this meeting breaks up, I'll send it out. It'll be a little bit easier administratively for me to pick it out of all the streams we get.
Great. I just was looking forward to watching people collaring you. And we'll get to work toot sweet on these working groups, with the first two goals being one to clarify the projects. I'm sorry. Did I hear? I'm sorry, Dennis.
You may given the topics, you may even want to do a straw vote just to see if there is any kind of balance amongst these right now, because you could get real-time feedback if you're so inclined, Mr. Chairman.
I would always take your suggestion. Okay, so the question is how many folks want to raise their hands to volunteer now for one or the other, one or any of these? And I would also say that that one of the things that has been very productive in past tax has been the fact that the expertise may not sit at this table on a particular topic, but supporting you or elsewhere in your companies may reside that kind of expertise. And working through you, we encourage you to involve those kinds of people as well. So, who's interested in Spectrum Frontiers? This is great. Okay, so you're going to
just do a quick head count.
Okay, so
I will still send out the email message just to maintain my sanity, or partial sanity. All right.
It's a test of how fast Walt can write. You got it?
An approximation.
Okay. Who's interested in COTS? Ed? Shahed.
You've identified a chairman.
Oh, okay. That's right. That's right. Okay. Glenn? Paul? Nomi? All right. Dennis's group. Look at this, huh? Greg, Dale, Dennis, Brian, Paul. Okay. Resiliency. We didn't have any discussion about resilience. So, resiliency. Look at this. Everybody's putting their hands up. Yeah, I think we'll have to.
Could you just let us know how that breaks down when you do, please?
You got it ready?
Yeah.
Okay. And then cyber. This was a great idea, Dennis. Another one of your great ideas. Okay. Thank you, everybody. This is one of the things that makes this such a great group, that you all are dedicated, involved, and are willing to invest your time like this. So thank you.
I took quick notes, but again, the official record will be your response to the email.
We got video proof that these guys volunteered.
Yeah,
huh?
I've done that before.
You know?
Some of them carefully sit so you can only see the backs of their heads. I've noticed it's always the same people.
So again, the first task here will be clarifying topics. The second task will be prioritizing, kind of what Ed Chan's point was a little while ago.
We didn't hear from Dave when he raised his hand. We didn't see it.
Oh, Dave. Dave, are you still there?
This Dave?
Yeah. Did you raise your hand? Did you raise your hand?
I virtually raised my hand for resiliency.
Resiliency, great. And KC, are you there?
I am here.
And have you raised your hand?
Yeah, I'm also interested in resiliency, especially with the security angle. We do a lot of measurement, actually, that might be relevant in that space.
Cool.
Okay, so if you raise your hand in the forest, nobody does it.
This is Walt's new rule. Okay, so we will get to scheduling these as quickly as possible, hopefully starting as soon as next week. You want to throw that? Let's throw up the slide that's right now, and you can see who the staff teams are that you will be working with. I won't.
In fact, it would be a good idea, in response to the email, if you could CC who's ever on the staff for that, I'll attach that to the email I send out, and I'll give you the email addresses.
So it's
Get in the mail.
Yeah, okay. So Frontiers are Michael and John. COTS is Walter and Chris. Spectrum is Julius and Bob. Resiliency is Henning and Rebecca. And Cyber is Ahmed and Greg. And we will be meeting, just so you know how we progress then at this end. While you all are having your groups, the 6 or 8 of us, I guess it's now the 10, 12 of us, 10 or 11 of us, sit down at this end and try and manage the process both within your groups and amongst your groups with a goal towards, and here's the managing to delivery kind of a thing, that in June we're back here again, and we would like to be hearing from the groups, A, your priorities, and B, the kind of early stage deliverables that you see developing out of those priorities. So to set expectations for the June meeting, that's what we're going to be looking forward to have accomplished over the next several months. Anybody have any questions on process or anything else? Anything that anybody want to bring to the group for the general good of the group? Yes, Dave.
Sorry to delay the meeting. This is something that sort of came up in the Spectrum Frontiers, and I decided to just hold it off because that discussion was going well. It was kind of a question around global harmonization. And particularly I've noticed that there is a lot of interest. Spectrum sharing, sort of got going within the PCAST. FCC has been very active. I'm detecting a lot of interest globally in the harmonization around spectrum sharing. I realize that there's probably questions about what the FCC does, what it doesn't, and I'm wondering if there's a potential role for the TAC here or not, and perhaps even joint with some other organization if it's not solely an FCC jurisdiction.
So the Commission has begun a rulemaking, am I right, folks? Was it a rulemaking on sharing, or was it an NOI? Didn't the Commission take some action on 3.5?
Yeah.
It's in a PRM.
I think it's just a question of which group we'd have cover it. because I think that the scope was broad enough actually for the first three groups, whether it's the frontiers or spectrum, although I think that's probably more technical. So it might fit in either one of the first two groups.
Yeah. So
And we've got a couple of proceedings that are going on. We got the one on 3.5. We've got, and there's the broader question about the commercial wireless harmonization and what we can do there.
Well, my question was actually more global, is whether or not that, I'm detecting a lot of interest in other countries on the way spectrum sharing could actually help with the harmonization issue. And I'm wondering if there's some way, the TAC can sort of help the FCC with some form of outreach. I don't know how the FCC, I honestly just don't know how the FCC approaches this, so I thought I'd maybe just surface it and then leave it to you guys to think about, not so much try to trigger a major discussion here. But so if you did decide to do something, it didn't come as a surprise to everybody at our next meeting.
Good point. Okay. Thanks, David. Anybody else want to throw anything out for the cause? Well, thank you, everybody. We are going to give you 40 minutes of your life back. And we recognize this is a non-trivial time contribution that you make both for these meetings and for the working group sessions. Thank you very much for all of your contributions. We stand adjourned until the next meeting in June. Thank you.